just heard that some of you may be totally new to this. Well, my respects that you actually hang in there. It's so difficult. Wow. By the way, please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying shamatha is not important. Of course, it's extremely important. Don't get me wrong. But all I'm trying to say here is that sometimes we need to check. Do we use shamatha as to just solve problems? Do we become attached to it? And then we have to leave it behind like a boat. It's just a means. We reach those means, we move on to something else, and we go back. Right? It's just like food. It's like with food. If we only eat salad, we'll lack the nutrition. So balance is important. Balance practice. But shamatha, of course, is very important. Okay. Anyway. Here, the first syllogism is talking about abandoned like a boat, which is saying everything, it's a means, it's a method, and when we reach the goal, we have to let go of that. So everything is in like in Buddhist practice, it's practice and it's a means and method, and at some point we need to let go. So it's like you don't carry the boat around with you once you're on the shore. Maybe if it's an expensive, precious boat, you may actually, but no. Okay, so actually here, the Dharma scripture, and this is what Benjamin Sotaba explains right after these four syllogisms are given, so I might as well say it from the beginning. There is a difference. They say Dharma teachings that come from the Buddha's mouth directly are ultimate Dharma versus us repeating them. If I repeat the Heart Sutra, it's still the Heart Sutra, right? If I recite the Heart Sutra, as a prayer or as a teaching, you would still call it the Heart Sutra. It's still a teaching from the Buddha. But it comes from a sentient being. It's a conventional refuge. When the Buddha speaks it, right? I mean, even Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara are speaking, but they're blessed. The Buddha specifically blessed their mind to speak it. So even then you could kind of argue, well, it doesn't come from the Buddha's mouth, so maybe it isn't. I don't know. I really don't know. But basically, anything that comes from the Buddha himself, that is ultimate refuge. So it always depends on who's saying something. That's why there's a difference. If I say the same word, and His Holiness says the same words in English, very different effect on a person's mind. Obviously, coming from the person's, depending on the person's mind who's saying it. Which is why when the Buddha himself says it, it's an ultimate refuge. When the same words are repeated by someone else, they are conventional refuge. By someone else as like a non-Buddha. Okay? So that this needs to be distinguished and said later on. So anyway, the Dharma scripture is not an ultimate refuge here. Dharma scripture that is not given by the Buddha himself. That is not an ultimate refuge. Okay? Here, Dharma scripture, and it says that here. It says just Dharma scripture, but later on it's specified. Then the second is regarding the subject in Arya Bodhisattva's wisdom that directly realizes selflessness. That's also not an ultimate refuge because it's a deceptive phenomenon, because it depends on the imprints of ignorance. It depends on the imprints of ignorance. Actually, as long as you still have the imprints of ignorance, whatever you do still depends on the... Why does it depend on the imprints of ignorance? Because you cannot meditate directly on the wisdom, directly perceiving emptiness, unless you have the motivation to go into that meditative state. And you have to have the motivation because you have the imprints of ignorance. Without a motivation, you can't do anything. Right? It's because of the ignorance. The ignorance keeps us from being spontaneous, from being like, well, spontaneous is relative. Of course, we say, oh, I spontaneously invited him. But it's not as spontaneous as here. It's in relation to not planning for weeks ahead that I will invite him. That's what it means. I mean, even in everyday language, we say, let's look at the situation objectively. I mean, never really objectively, but we can use the word. It means in relation to, not seeing it in connection with lots of emotion, without being like totally influenced by certain emotions. That's what objectively means. We say Israel is an independent country, but it's not saying it's totally independent of everything else. That's just from the perspective of politics. So likewise here, we say that spontaneous, we can spontaneously do this, that, and the other. But actual spontaneity is only possible for a Buddha, because we always need a motivation first to do so. However subtle that is, we may not be aware of it. So here in this case, a bodhisattva arising, like entering the meditative absorption into emptiness, it still depends on the imprints of ignorance, in the sense that it depends on the motivation to do so, and that is due to the imprints. Right? So anyway, anything a bodhisattva does, anything we do right now is in one way or another influenced by the obstructions. Okay? Influenced to a certain degree, we are obstructed by it, we can only do it because we have a motivation, etc. But of course, I'm not saying that motivation is not good, and motivation is important, but we can't do without. And so we need a positive one instead of a harmful one. Then regarding the subject, the Hinayana Nirvana without remainder. Nirvana without remainder is really just saying, once you reach Nirvana, when you reach Nirvana, when you become an Arhat, okay? When you become an Arhat, you become an Arhat with this ordinary body. Still the ordinary body. Different from a bodhisattva on the path of seeing, once they die, after they reach the path of seeing, they are now no longer reborn as a result of afflictions and karma. They are reborn now out of love and compassion and prayers that drive their rebirth, and they have a choice. They have a choice where they're reborn. When you're a Hinayana practitioner, that is when you aim towards self-liberation, you don't have the same degree of love and compassion that could determine your rebirth. So you're in samsara until the last moment you become an Arhat, right? A moment later, you've now become an Arhat, but you're still within samsara. Because your aggregates are still samsaric aggregates. Your mind is no longer samsaric, but your body is still samsara. It's still the result of karma and afflictions. So that is nirvana with a remainder, a samsaric remainder. But then you will naturally die at some point. Your body comes with an expiry date, in the sense that you accumulated a karma to be reborn as a human being, and it comes along with a certain length of time. You can die before that, but you cannot, unless you engage in certain practices. It can be possible to extend your life if you do some very advanced practices, but usually for an ordinary person it comes with an expiry date. I usually say it kind of like, this is how long you can live. Alright? So even Arhat, they have no reason to extend the life of this body in general. So the body naturally one day it dies, but the consciousness, that is free from obscuration, so it continues on. The mind is still there. And so that mind now is the mind that has achieved nirvana without remainder, because the remaining samsaric aggregates are gone now. Now they're really out of samsara. Samsara is really gone now. Mind and body are pure. Okay? No body. No need for a body. If they enter the Mahayana path, then they need to take on a body. Then it's through their prayers. It's like a mental body that they generate. It's really like in Tantra, I guess it's explained better. It's the subtle energy forms another body, because you need to have a body to be a bodhisattva. To work for the benefit of others, you need to have a body, so they take on a body again. But the point is here that once you reach the Hinayana Nirvana without remainder, so you're in that state where you don't have a body yet, it is not an ultimate refuge, because it's merely an absence or elimination of the truth of suffering and the truth of origin. So you still have more to eliminate, basically. It's not a final refuge, because there's more to be eliminated. It's merely the absence of the truth of suffering and the truth of origin. And nirvana with remainder, you still have which truth? Truth of suffering and truth of origin. Which truth have you removed? Which one do you still have? When you're a nirvana with remainder.
You have the origin.
When you have, what is nirvana with remainder? You've become an arhat and you still have this body. So, do you have a truth of, what have you eliminated and what do you still have? Truth of suffering and truth of origin. What do you still have? Truth of origin? Ja, nein. Ja, nein. Ohne N. Ja, nein. So you're saying a truth of origin?
You still have.
What is the truth of origin you still have when you have a body?
You still have cognitive obscurations.
You still have cognitive obscurations? What are they? What are... Oh, cognitive, sorry. No. The afflictive... Here when we talk about the Four Noble Truth from the point of view of the Hinayana, so the truth of origin are the afflictive obscurations, not the cognitive ones. Those you get rid of. So, what do you still have? Do you have any? Do you have the truth of suffering, the truth of origin, both you got rid of? You still have karma. You still have contaminated karma. Okay. You still have contaminated karma. And what else do you still have?
An aging body.
Pardon?
An aging body.
An aging body. What is that?
Suffering.
It's a truth of suffering. It's not suffering. An aging body is not suffering. What is suffering? A feeling. It's a feeling. A truth of suffering and a suffering are different. Suffering is a feeling. A body is not a feeling. But a truth of suffering. A truth of suffering is something which is in the nature of suffering. So an arhat is said to still experience physical suffering. Right? Physical pain. Still possible to get sick. Or have at least sick. But there's no mental suffering. No mental suffering whatsoever. So there's this debate a little bit. Some would say there's no physical suffering. But physical pain is just not seen as pain. It's not seen as something negative. A lot of our pain is really mental. That's gone. But an arhat with remainder, yes, has no longer... Is there a truth of cessation? So is there a truth of suffering? Yes, because of the body. Is there a truth of origin? Well, there's no negative karma. That is gone. There is no misapprehension of reality. There are no afflictions, but there's still virtuous contaminated karma. That goes on its own once the body is gone and is associated with afflictions, etc. That is gone afterwards. So contaminated means as a result of afflictions. So contaminated karma, even virtuous karma, as long as it's influenced by our self-grasping. Those actions, the residues of those actions, even if they're virtuous, they're contaminated. But you don't eliminate them, they're not an object of elimination. An object of elimination is that which keeps you from becoming an arhat. You can become an arhat and still have that virtuous contaminated karma. Because virtuous karma doesn't serve as a problem. It's contaminated, but alright. Now you will no longer, because there's no longer any new contaminated karma that's accumulated, because there's no longer the basic misapprehension of reality. But nonetheless, you still have that karma, and it'll just go on its own when the body is gone, because that's the basis for it. It's based on the body. Okay? So, once that's gone, I mean, there's a bit of debate on when do you really lose it, etc. But the point is usually, once you let go of the body is gone, then there's nothing left from before. There's no longer a truth of suffering. There's no longer a truth of origin. Okay? Does that make sense? It's a little bit debatable, but anyway. All right. So therefore, we're still in samsara. So in other words, there's a quote in Benji Sontapa's text where it says, an arhat is someone who has abandoned samsara. And then I think, no, not necessarily. Some of them are still in samsara because they still have that body, but not mentally in samsara. That's the difference. Okay.
So why don't you, if the arhat is still with remainder, the source of suffering is not completed yet, and the source of origin has?
None of those, yeah. So when they still have a body, they still have the truth of suffering, and as we've heard, they still have contaminated virtuous karma. So they've not eliminated that, and so in that sense.
What about the self-cherishing? They also have a little.
No. You see, this is a little bit complicated, self-cherishing. It depends how you define it. There's self-cherishing and there's self-cherishing. No. There's two versions, like two explanations of self-cherishing. There's the one that is a result of the misapprehension of reality, of perceiving an inherently existent I, which then gives rise to a sense that gives rise to an exaggeration of the importance of the I and the importance of its happiness. And that gives rise to a type of attachment, which we usually call self-centeredness or self-cherishing. This type of self-cherishing you cannot have when you're an arhat, because that which gives rise to it, that root misapprehension, is no longer there. But there's another type of self-cherishing that sometimes people, they use the same word, though I'm not sure it's the same word. It's kind of like self-concerned. Being more concerned, let's say, put it that way, not being concerned more with your own happiness, but not being concerned, being only concerned with removing your own suffering and not being concerned with removing the suffering of others. Wishing others to be happy, of course, wishing everyone to be free from suffering, but only being interested in removing your own suffering because of believing I cannot help others to remove their suffering. They have to do it on their own. Due to that very strong belief, you are still not generating great compassion that's a basis for bodhicitta. So the kind of great compassion where you yourself want to learn or to become a person that you can be of the greatest benefit to other sentient beings, right? And at a certain stage you still believe, I can't do anything, I can only remove my own suffering. That is another type. Sometimes people call that self-cherishing. So it depends on how you define it. That you would still have even if you're an arhat. Because you're used to it, thinking, I want to remove my own suffering. I'd do anything to help others, but I can't. So I can only wish for them to be happy, and I do so. I sincerely wish them to be happy. So you have metta, you have karuna, right? Compassion, you have love. For all sentient beings, okay, so great compassion, great love. However, not that you take personal responsibility or even have the wish to do so. So that is still left. And this is what's confusing, because you use the same word, and it's like, but so then they say, that's when people say, a Hinayana arhat is selfish. No, I mean, it depends how you define selfish. Not selfish as in like attachment to the self, self-grasping. All that is gone. However, not yet that others' welfare is like, I'm now dedicating myself to others. That, to the degree that a bodhisattva has, not yet. Which can be easily attained, and then usually it says when an arhat reaches the level of being an arhat. Actually, we should all say, well, why do we become an arhat first, right? Why? Because you become an arhat on the path of meditation anyway. Before you become a Buddha, you go to the path of, you on the 8th level, you become an arhat, and then you become a Buddha. So why, not in the beginning, why do you enter the Mahayana path right from the beginning? Why not first enter the Hinayana path? Because it's relatively easy to become an arhat. It takes 3 lifetimes. To become a Buddha, you have to accumulate merit that at least equals 3 countless eons. You know, to be around 3 countless eons. There's 2 interpretations, but it makes more sense to say just a lot of merit. You don't need that kind of merit to become a Hinayana arhat. So why not go that way fast? It would make more sense and much faster. And then you've gone, your suffering is gone, great. And then you enter the Mahayana path, and it takes as long as you want, but at least you're free. Why not choose that way? Yes, advice?
Because I think when you aim to be free for yourself, it can be very difficult to change
the attitude.
The motivation, and then that's what they're afraid. The bodhisattva, they will be.
Yeah, they're afraid of just being concerned for themselves in that positive way. Why? Because the thing is, like, I look at it, I'm not sure. But I look at it like, if you want to go somewhere, I usually take the example going from Dharamsala to Delhi or going to Calcutta or Bombay. That's, if you imagine this was like something blissful, right? So if your goal is to go to Delhi, well, you're going to plan to go to Delhi, and that's where you, once you're there, you're going to stay there for a while, because that's where you wanted to go. You never wanted to go anywhere else. Well, if you want to go to Bombay, you'll have to still travel via Delhi. But you just take the train that stops for a few moments and go on right away. So that's similar here. There's a train that actually stops for a few minutes and they go on. So what I'm trying to say is that once, if you only want to become liberated, if they're in the back of your mind, you're not want in any way, right? You want liberation, but really you want it to continue on for sentient beings. If that's not your agenda, that's just not your plan, then once you reach nirvana, you're going to stay in that state.
Because it's egocentric, no? Actually, isn't it?
Well, it's kind of in comparison to a Buddha, to a Bodhisattva, it's kind of, you could call it selfish, but it's not really selfish in an ordinary sense. So just in comparison, in relation to, but otherwise it's not selfish actually, because it's selfish comes along with attachment, and once you're an arhat, you're no longer attached, but the habit is not there. And they say you remain in this blissful state that actually sometimes undig bodies of arhats, they say, like in Kuno or some other places, they found these bodies that mummified, because the mind was still in there for a long period of time, so the body didn't decay, because the mind just remained in there, they say. Or at some point the mind leaves, but they say the mind can actually stay there for a long time. It's just meditating on that blissful state. So actually, if the mind remains in there, the body wouldn't decay. It's just mummifies, basically. Like, I don't know how that works, but that's kind of their explanation, that you have these bodhisattvas in mountains, deep in arhats, that they're still meditating. They're in these blissful states. And maybe at some point their body actually does decay, but their mind just remained there because they wanted to go to Delhi in the first place, and they just enjoy being in Delhi, right? So it's like this blissful state that you're in, and it's a very deep absorption where the mind is totally absorbed into the state of nirvana. Makes sense, doesn't it? That's what you looked for, that's what you were aiming for, and now you get there. Not for everyone, of course. There's some very quickly, they arise from that, but you just never know. And it is said, of course we hear about arhats like Shariputra, being around other people, helping them, etc. Anyway, there's some talk that they're actually bodhisattvas, they're not actually, but never mind what it is. The point is, this is not true for everyone, but that's a danger. That's why it's seen as a detour. Because if you really want to eventually to benefit sentient beings, but you're stuck in that blissful state, well, sentient beings are suffering. Maybe the Dharma is around right now. You could really effectively help people. If once you get out of it, it's at a time when no one is ever interested in the Dharma. It's too late, for instance. So that's why they say it's better to enter the Mahayana path. But it's also said that the Buddhas try to communicate with these arhats at all times, to inspire them to get out of this. The meditation, come on, there's more work to be done. So mentally kind of trying to arouse them from their meditation, which when it's very deep, it's very difficult. But at some point it loosens apparently, and they do arise because the bodhisattvas inspire them and treat them. The word is called, like the word they use for gulva, samgulva, like gulva is in like entreat them, kind of shake them, inspire them, whatever word you want to use. So, and then they go, okay, and they can communicate, and eventually they're inspired. So that's the reason that's usually given. One of the reasons that's usually given, you don't want to go that way, right? Because of the habit and because of that joyful state. It's not out of attachment, it's just that's what you aim for. You get into that absorption, like the mind it deserves to be happy, experience that blissful state, and it's worked hard to reach it. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Okay, so going back to this, in that nirvana, therefore, it's not a final refuge, and regarding the subject here, arhats, they're not ultimate truth, because they have fear of cognitive obstructions. So here are arhats, once they're arhats, and once they understand there's more work to be done, there's still the fear of cognitive obstruction. So they would then take refuge, at some point, once they realize there are obstructions, and they're interested in removing them. Okay, so therefore the Dharma scriptures, there are two types. The Dharma scripture and the two types of Dharma in the continuum of sentient beings in the assembly of Aryas who have not yet attained enlightenment do not represent stable and foremost ultimate refuges. However, Dharma scriptures that according to the Attara Tantra is not an ultimate refuge needs to be specified here. So Gyaltsabje explains in his commentary on Maitreya's Uttara Tantra. So Gyaltsabje is one of the main disciples of Lama Tsongkhapa, who founded the Gilitwa tradition, based on which this is written, that the Dharma of scripture described here as being an ultimate refuge does not refer to the words that were actually spoken by the Buddha, or literally that pertain to the Buddha's continuum, that were kind of connected to the Buddha's continuum. So the Tibetan word is pertains, it belongs, it's included in the Buddha's continuum, which is basically just saying it's conjoined, it's affected by the Buddha's mind. The words the Buddha speaks are affected by the Buddha's mind. The words that I speak, even though the same words, are affected by my mind. Okay? And there's a difference. So it's described here as being not an ultimate refuge, I should say, not as being an ultimate refuge. Okay, so that's the difference. I explained this earlier on. So what is ultimate refuge? For instance, also the teachings of a Buddha that appear to the ear or the mental consciousness, we hear, the words we hear are not the ultimate refuge. The words the Buddha speaks are the ultimate refuge. The words we hear are also not an ultimate refuge. But of course they affect us. They affect us greatly because they come from an ultimate refuge. So there's a difference between the words spoken and the words we perceive. And that also accounts for that they say, when the Buddha says something, everyone hears something different. So the Buddha said it all together, but I pick up on only one thing. Anyway, when I say something, just as an ordinary person, when I say something, I say it with a certain idea in mind. But you hear those words, it doesn't mean you pick up on this idea that I have, right? Or you say something to me, I don't pick up on what you actually mean necessarily. Right? So that makes perfect sense, therefore. What I hear and what you say is different.
So is there a mistake in should be not altogether?
Yes, the not is missing. I thought.
Described her as being not altogether.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It was a not, yes. There's a word missing. Described here as not being an ultimate refuge, right? Does not refer to the words that were actually spoken by the Buddha, or literally that are included or pertain to the Buddha's continuum, that's the Tibetan phrase. It's rather this Dharma of scripture that is not an ultimate refuge, refers to the teachings of the Buddha that appear to the ear or mental consciousness of sentient beings. So an example of scriptural Dharma that is a conventional object of refuge is the heart sutra that appears to practitioner's ear consciousness when it's recited before the teachings. Oh, so does this say that me reciting it as an ultimate? No, I don't think. It's actually just talking about what you hear. Yes, no, of course, it cannot be because of what I said earlier. So what the Buddha says directly, that's an ultimate refuge, but what is spoken by us, or what is heard by us as sentient beings, is not an ultimate refuge. Yes. Yeah, there's a mistake. There's a not missing. Where's the mistake? Yes, it says in the fourth line, described here as being an ultimate refuge, described here as being not an ultimate refuge. Right? Before it says in the Dharma of scripture is not an ultimate object of refuge. And here it needs to be specified. The specific Dharma of refuge, Dharma of scripture, is not an ultimate refuge, and there's a specific one that is. So that we have to can't generalize here, in other words. So then Maitreya says, in a true sense, only the Buddha is the refuge of migratory beings, since the conqueror is just another word for Buddha, possesses the Dharmakaya, and since the